Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Judge, thank you again for your time. I made a note earlier, Senator Blumenthal had mentioned that to do this job that you are before us, wanting to take on, it takes book smarts and people smarts. And I think that's a very appropriate summation. And as we have spent the past few weeks going through your records, getting to know you, reading letters that have come in about you, hearing from people, I've kind of looked at it and said, okay, she has been richly blessed with God-given talents. And then she has experiences and education. And then coupling with that, hopes, desires, and a lot of drive that really make you the person that you are. And we have heard from your friends about how you are a friend and you've been a mentor. And as one of my friends would say, and I bet you kind of feel this void, you're the answer lady for a lot of issues that friends would bring to you. You love your family, and they obviously love you. And I wish you could see your dad's face. It is wonderful. He beams when you talk about the things that he has taught you. But all of that has been repeated time and again in letters for you. But it's important that we know this, and it's why we continue to ask you about your views on issue, because all of that goes into forming who you are and your worldview, and it all is applicable to the job that you've done in the past, and likewise the job that you are going to do in the future. And it does have bearing on different issues. And it's been so interesting to me to get text messages from friends at home that are watching this. I had one from a friend from church. And she said, you know, she seems really likable, but I'm not sure I agree with her on the issues. And this is someone who is incredibly pro-life. And she's about my age, so she's a mom and a grandmom. And this is a question that is important to her, to look at life. And Senator Feinstein talked about that issue with you a little earlier today. You've also said today that it would be inappropriate for you to share your views on political issues or issues that might come before the court, like abortion. But I want to go to you on something you said when you were in private practice. You made your views on pro-life and the pro-life movement very clear. And in fact, you attacked pro-life women. And this was in a brief that you wrote. You described them, and I'm quoting, hostile, noisy crowd of in-your-face protesters, end quote. And you advocated against these women's First Amendment right to express their sincerely held views regarding the sanctity of each individual life. And I'm a pro-life woman. 79% of the American women support restrictions of some type on abortion. And so I find it incredibly concerning that someone who is nominated to a position with life tenure on the Supreme Court holds such a hostile view toward a view that is held as a mainstream belief that every life is worth protecting. So how do you justify that incendiary rhetoric against pro-life women?
Thank you, Senator. The brief that you're referring to was a brief that I filed on behalf of clients who were clients of my law firm. This is in, I believe, goodness, 1999 or 2000, maybe 2000 or 2001.
Yeah.
I was an associate at a law firm, and I had appellate experience because I had just finished my Supreme Court law clerk position. And in the context of my law firm, I was asked to work on a brief concerning a buffer zone issue. In Massachusetts at the time, there were laws protecting women who wanted to enter clinics, and there was a First Amendment question about the degree to which there had to be room around them to enter the clinic.
Right.
And-
I understand all of that. I'm asking about the rhetoric.
Senator, I drafted a brief along with
Okay.
the partners in my law firm who reviewed it, and we filed it on behalf of our client
Okay.
to advance our client's arguments that they wanted to make in the
Okay.
case.
Let me ask you this. When you go to church and knowing there are pro-life women there, do you look at them, thinking of them in that way, that they're noisy, hostile, in your face? Do you think of them? Do you think of pro-life women like me that way?
Senator, that was a statement and a brief made
Okay.
an argument for my client. It's not the way that I think of or
Okay.
characterize people.
All right, thank you for the clarification on that, because I think even zealous advocacy doesn't allow that type of rhetoric on a free speech issue. You know, Roe v. Wade, let's talk a little bit about that. It's come up touch today. In my opinion, that was an awful act of judicial activism and has cost the lives of over 63 million unborn children. And nearly 50 years later, this shameful ruling remains binding precedent, but the battle is being fought in the courts. And as you know, and as we discussed when we visited, the Supreme Court is reconsidering whether the Constitution protects the right to an abortion in Dobbs. And if you're confirmed, you will be in a position to apply the court's decision in Dobbs, whatever that decision is going to be. And you've talked about following precedent and what the court decides. So do you commit to respecting the court's decision if it rules that Roe was wrongly decided and that the issue of abortion should be sent back to the states?
Senator, whatever the Supreme Court decides in Dobbs will be the precedent of the Supreme Court. It will be worthy of respect in the sense that it is the precedent, and I commit to treating it as I would any other precedent of the Supreme Court.
There's one other thing. One of the central issues in the Dobbs case is about whether the Constitution protects the right to an abortion. So let's talk about that. Can you explain to me on a constitutional basis the court's decision in Roe, and where is abortion protected in the Constitution?
Senator, abortion is a right that the Supreme Court has recognized is one of the kinds of rights that is unenumerated. It is in that same category of rights that the Supreme Court has recognized.
But the text of the Constitution does not mention abortion.
That is true.
That
Yes.
is true. That is correct. So you agree that the Constitution does not mention the right to an abortion, and yet, through one of the most brazen acts of judicial activism, our Supreme Court created the right through Roe v. Wade. This is why Americans. This is why so many women that I've talked to are really concerned about who sits on the federal bench. We need a justice who will adhere to the text of the Constitution. You've talked a little bit about that today as you talked about historical context. And they don't want justices who are going to invent rights out of whole cloth to serve a political interest. Let's move on. I want to go to when you were at Harvard, your thesis entitled "The Hand of Oppression: Plea Bargaining Processes." In that piece, you argued that judges have, and I'm quoting, I brought this up yesterday, personal hidden agendas that influence how they decide cases. So what personal hidden agendas do you harbor, or do you think other judges harbor?
Thank you, Senator. That line, to the extent it appears in my thesis, was written by someone who had not gone to law school and was senior in college, who had spent a summer at an internship working in making observations in the context of a criminal justice internship. It is not a view
Okay,
that I
then-
hold.
What led you to that belief?
I'm thinking back, it's been 30 years, but
Okay.
the summer before my senior year, I interned at a public defender's office in New York. And I was part of a team of, there was lawyers and interns on this team, and they were
Okay.
handling misdemeanor cases. And
So it was from an internship experience?
yes, before I became a lawyer.
All right, let's go to something else. Senator Cruz was discussing with you, and I think this is important. It's something that parents all across the country are worried about, and that is the progressive indoctrination of their children and the pushing of critical race theory in the schools. And you told Senator Cruz that as a board member of the Georgetown Day School, you didn't have any control over what was taught at the school, no control over curriculum, and you weren't aware that the school was pushing CRT. But I would think that there would have been parents that came to you and said, have you seen these books? Are you aware that this is being taught, being on that school board?
No, Senator.
No one ever mentioned it.
Georgetown Day School is a private school. It's
Right.
it's not a public school.
I'm fully aware. And you mentioned that you said that you meant, you thought he meant that critical race theory isn't being taught in public schools, correct?
Yes.
Okay. But we know that's not the case. We know that CRT is being pushed in our K through 12 schools. And I've got a letter here, Mr. Chairman, that Senator Tuberville and I wrote last year to the National Education Association on this issue. I'd like to submit that to the record because it's relevant to our discussion.
Without objection.
And we had admonished the NEA for adopting pro-CRT materials during their annual organizing meeting and proposing to spend $127,000 in teachers' dues to combat opponents of CRT. And there are countless reports of CRT being pushed in the public school system. And a lot of parents that I work with every day, every week, don't have the funds to send their child to a private school. They're relying on the school systems, the public school systems, and it is important to them to have a Supreme Court that is going to protect parental rights to teach these children as parents see fit to have their children taught. And I will tell you too, with Georgetown Day School, I found it astounding that it teaches kindergartners, 5-year-old children, and I've got grandchildren. And they teach them that they can choose their gender. So is this what you were praising when you applauded the, and I'm quoting you, transformative power of Georgetown Day School's progressive education? Do you agree that our schools should teach children that they can choose their gender?
Senator, I'm not remembering exactly what quote you're referencing, but Georgetown Day School is
It was in a book,
in a
and you gave the quote.
Georgetown Day School is a private school.
Yes.
That
Yeah, I'm asking, do you agree that schools should teach children that they can choose their gender?
Senator, I'm not making comments about
All right.
what schools can teach.
Let
their-
me ask you this then. United States versus Virginia, the Supreme Court struck down VMI's male-only admission policy. Writing for the majority, Justice Ginsburg stated, supposed inherent differences are no longer accepted as a ground for race or national origin classifications. Physical differences between men and women, however, are enduring. The two sexes are not fungible. A community made up exclusively of one sex is different from a community composed of both. Do you agree with Justice Ginsburg that there are physical differences between men and women that are enduring?
Senator, respectfully, I am not familiar with that particular quote or case.
Okay.
So it's hard for me to
Okay.
comment as to whether
All
or
right.
not.
I'd love to get your opinion on that, and you can submit that. Do you interpret Justice Ginsburg's meaning of men and women as male and female?
Again, because I don't know the case, I don't know how I interpret it. I need to read the whole
Okay.
thing.
Can you provide a definition for the word woman?
Can I provide a definition? No,
Yeah,
I can't.
you can't?
Not in
Okay.
this context.
So you
I'm not a
believe the meaning
biologist.
of the word woman is so unclear and controversial that you can't give me a definition?
Senator, in my work as a judge, what I do is I address disputes. If there's a dispute about a definition, people make arguments, and I look at the
All right.
law and I decide. So I'm not,
The fact that you can't give me a straight answer about something as fundamental as what a woman is underscores the dangers of the kind of progressive education that we are hearing about. Just last week, an entire generation of young girls watched as our taxpayer-funded institutions permitted a biological man to compete and beat a biological woman in the NCAA swimming championships. What message do you think this sends to girls who aspire to compete and win in sports at the highest levels?
Senator, I'm not sure what message that sends. If you're asking me about the legal issues related to it, those are topics that are being hotly discussed, as you say,
Right.
and could come to the court. So I'm not
And
able to.
I think it tells our girls that their voices don't matter. I think it tells them that they're second-class citizens, and parents want to have a Supreme Court justice who is committed to preserving parental autonomy and protecting our nation's children. So let's move on. I want to go to the child porn issue, and I know that we've discussed this today on several different times. What's troublesome to me is your consistent pattern of sentencing these predators below the sentences recommended by the government and the sentencing guidelines. and Senator Cruz, Senator Hawley have laid out some of these disparities. I know Senator Blumenthal mentioned the Kids Online Safety Act that he and I are working on. You have talked about how horrifying it was to get some of that information. As we have held these hearings, that too has been horrifying. We've had moms from all over the country call us and tell us their story of how these pedophiles, these child abusers, these pornographers are using technology. And that technology has really advanced. And unfortunately, we know that online right now, it is more dangerous for kids than ever. Here's a couple of stats for you. In 21, NCMEC's cyber tip line received nearly 30 million reports of online child sexual abuse material, which is a 35% increase over 2020. Those 30 million tips contained 44.8 million videos and 39.9 million images. And as a mom and a grandmom, this is an issue of tremendous concern. I have grandsons that are 12 and 13 years old. And these are things that concern me, how these people work. I find the discussion that you made, the distinction you made between pedophiles who produce child pornography and those who are only collectors to be one without a difference. You said, and I'm quoting you, that it was a mistake to assume that child pornography offenders are pedophiles. Do you believe that it matters to the children and their parents who suffer abuse, what motivation those abusers had?
Thank you, Senator. As you said, and as I've said, these cases are among the most difficult
They are.
for judges who have to deal with the evidence, judges who, like me, are
My
parents.
question, Judge, do you think it matters to the kids and their parents, the motives of the abuser, of the pornographer?
Senator, it does not matter
Okay.
to the victims in these cases what the motivation is. The quote, I'm not exactly sure where it came from. I know that what Senator Cruz showed me before was questions that I was asking in the context of a hearing to.
Okay. Well, I've got some serious concerns about that. I do want to go to your judicial philosophy and back to the Ninth Amendment. President Biden said he was looking for a judicial nominee with a judicial philosophy that is more of one that suggests that there are unenumerated rights in the Constitution and all the amendments mean something, including the Ninth Amendment. You told Senator Lee that you didn't discuss this statement with President Biden, but I want to know whether you agree with it. Do you share the judicial philosophy that President Biden is looking for? And Senator Kennedy tried to walk through some of this with you. Do you believe that the Ninth Amendment is a source of unenumerated rights?
Senator, the Supreme Court has not found any unenumerated rights that derive from the Ninth Amendment. And so that's not the precedent of the court. And there aren't any rights that have been established under that provision of the Constitution.
Okay. White House Chief of Staff Ron Klain has written that the Supreme Court should intervene whenever the nation's conscience and laws need a jolt in a progressive direction. Presumably, that is what he and his boss, President Biden, expect a justice to do. So do you believe that the role of the court is to intervene whenever we need a jolt in a progressive direction? And would you do that through the unenumerated rights? Would you do it on issues like abortion or any other issue?
Senator, the role of a judge is to decide cases and controversies based on the facts and the law, mindful of their obligation to rule impartially and to remain in consideration of only the law and their constraints under the Constitution.
Okay. A lot of special interest groups have come out in support of your nomination. One of those is Demand Justice, and they are a progressive dark money group that has launched $1 million ad buy to push for your confirmation. Demand Justice is also pushing for radical changes to the structure of our country and our Constitution, including a demand that Democrats pack the Supreme Court. One of Demand Justice's board members has urged Senate Democrats to add 10 more justices to the court. It's clear that Demand Justice believes that if the issue of court packing were to come before you on the Supreme Court, you would rule in their favor. Are they wrong to believe that you would rule in their favor?
Senator, it's very unlikely that the issue of court packing would come before the Supreme Court. That question is in the province of Congress. It's a political question.
Okay. Let's see. I want to follow up on this Make the Road New York issue that has come up a couple of times today. Congress granted DHS sole and unreviewable discretion to determine which illegal immigrants should be deported. This means DHS's decision was unreviewable by a federal judge, and any attempt to challenge DHS's decision should have been dismissed by the court. And yet, you did the very opposite. You didn't dismiss it. You inexplicably construed the law to permit a judicial challenge to DHS's immigration decision, despite the plain language of the statute. The D.C. Circuit, where you sit, reversed you. It noted that it could hardly imagine a more definitive expression of congressional intent than the one in the law at issue. And it questioned how you could have come to any other conclusion based on the text of the statute. So I'd like to know what was ambiguous about the immigration law that we enacted, and we explicitly stated that DHS's decision was unreviewable. What more could we possibly have said or have made clear that you were not authorized to review DHS's decision?
Thank you, Senator. When Congress strips the court of jurisdiction, Congress, in many cases, does so explicitly. It says something other than sole and unreviewable. It says things like, no court shall hear, there's no jurisdiction to consider. There are ways that Congress clarifies that judges have no authority or no jurisdiction to hear a particular case. The D.C. Circuit considered jurisdiction with respect to this statute and this dispute and determined that the court did have jurisdiction, and the question was whether there was a cause of action to proceed. What I determined in looking at the statutes at issue in this particular case is that sole and unreviewable meant that DHS had the sole power to make a decision about.
Not to interrupt you, my time is going to run out, and I want to be respectful of getting you out of here tonight. But we were clear in what we said on that, and I heard your explanation on that earlier today. That's why I wanted to come back to it tonight, because this is the kind of judicial activism that really concerns Tennesseans. these issues that I've been through with you today, your statements that I gave back to you last night in my opening, things that you had said, decisions that you had made, these cause concern. So we'll take up a little bit more of it tomorrow. Thank you for your graciousness, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the time.